Hey guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to implement authentication for your backend in just under 6 minutes. So let's get started. So first things first, let's add Firebase Auth and Firestore to our project. To do this, you just need to upload your credentials JSON file, which you can get from the Firebase website, and Visual Backend takes care of the rest for you. Now it comes automatically with a middleware function that reads in the authorization header and passes it according to the bearer token format. Now, once we've read all that and verified the token using the method given to us from Firebase, we can then store the user ID, which we can get from the code value.uid inside our request object, which we will then use later on inside our endpoint functions. So next, we're going to write a create auth user function. And notice how the generate with AI switch is on. And what this does is that it will interact with GPT to actually generate some starter code for you, as you can see. And for this function, we actually just want to pass in an email and password and use that to create the auth user inside Firebase Auth. And finally, from the created user, we just want to return the user ID. And let's create a simple log statement so that we know whenever we create a new user inside Firebase Auth. So now we're going to create our Firestore module, and in here we're going to create a user collection which will be used to just store some additional data for our users, such as username. And the first thing we're going to do is write a create Firestore user function, which we will start with a template using the AI generator. And then we're going to pass in our user ID in here, which we generated from our create auth user function. And after that, just simply log whenever a new user is created. So now that that's done, we can start putting together our API. And the first thing we're going to do is create a middleware called log. And what this function is going to do is simply console.log the request method and request URL so that we can keep track of what's happening with our backend. And so now I'm going to create a post method called register. And what this is going to do is create a new user for our backend. And this takes in the username, email, and password from the client. And we're going to take that data and use the email and password to actually create an auth user inside Firebase Auth. And of course, this will return a user ID, which we will then use to create our Firestore user. So let's first return a status of 200 when a user is created successfully. And of course, we need to pass in our parameters of user ID as well as username and email for the user data to our create Firestore user function. So now that we're done with our register endpoint, we can move on to our next one, which will be to get the user's data. But before that, let's first create a route group which will contain all the endpoints that require authentication. And so inside, we're going to create a middleware which will help us check if the user is authenticated by calling the the Firebase Auth middleware function which we made earlier on. And so now that that is done, we can move on to creating our get user data function. So in this endpoint, the first thing we're going to do is actually extract the user ID from our request object, which should be stored if the user successfully authenticates inside our middleware. And so before we continue, let's first create a get Firestore user function, which will take in a user ID and after that return the user from the Firestore database. And once again, we're going to start with some template. And everything looks fine here. So let's just simply console.log when we've gotten our user from Firestore. And now we can use that in our get user endpoint by passing in the user ID from our request object. And it should return the correct user from our database. And we can then simply return that to the client with rest.status.send. And just to confirm, we are passing in our user ID in the get Firestore user function and everything looks fine. So now let's run our server and start testing our endpoints to see that everything is working correctly. The first thing we're going to do is go to our Firebase and just clear any existing data. So we're starting from afresh. So over here, we want to delete that and that should be fine. All right, so all our data is cleared and now we can start testing our endpoints, and we're going to first test the register endpoint. So we'll pass in our username, our email, and our password. And by the way, this is a front end which I made before this video just to test out all the different endpoints. And as you can see, our logs are coming out correctly. Everything seems to be working. And just to confirm, if we go to our Firebase console, we can see that a new authentication user was created and a new document was also created in Firestore. So everything looks fine. So now let's test out our login function, which we'll call the get user data. And so we'll pass in the same email and password which we used to create our account earlier on. And as you can see, the logs seem to be working correctly. We've gotten our user ID from the auth middleware, and also we've gotten the correct user data from Firestore. So everything seems to be working fine, and I hope you enjoyed seeing how you can implement auth using Visual Backend. Thank you.